what could work better, and where do we want it to go. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Jonathan to tell us a little bit about what has been achieved here at Wedge, because that is, I think, a good model for government to follow if it wants to start getting this stuff right.
Thank you, Julian. So welcome to Wedge. And I have to say, because Charlie Trelawney, who was going to be the person to tell you about what's going on at West Coast Gibbs Green Estates, is ill and hasn't been able to attend, I'm going to be dealing with that bit as well, because I'm involved in running that campaign. So that means I get to go off at the beginning like a double-barreled shotgun. So just to make it topical, I also want to welcome you to land which has been liberated by local rebels with the backing of the Conservative government. Something which is very much in vogue these days, and funnily enough, when you go back in history over the past 20 or 30 years, you do find that either by accident or by design, Conservative governments have a habit of enacting legislation or implementing policies which can lead to the greater empowerment of communities. So when this coalition government came into power, I have to say one of my first reactions was, whoopee, community empowerment is back in vogue. The Tories are back in office. Anyway, a very curious world that we live in. So just to tell you a bit about Wedge, back in the 1980s, the then Conservative Thatcher government wanted to demunicipalise council housing, and so they introduced a right for private landlords to take over council estates. In true Spin Doctrine style, they dubbed it tenant's choice, when in fact it was actually a landlord's choice and right. So we asked ourselves down here, we were fighting a big battle against Dame Shirley Porter, who was trying to knock down the estates, sell them off to developers, build twice as many in their place, destroy the existing community. The conditions around here in those days were very bad. And we asked ourselves, well, but what if the residence was the landlord, the private landlord that was going to be seeking transfer of the properties? Because after all, the whole thing had been skewed in such a way that it would make the thing viable to happen, because they wanted to they really did want to demunicipalise council housing. Anyway, to cut a long story short, big battle, lots of dirty tricks, smear campaigns. There was they probably descended to the worst ever act in local government history when they put homeless families with newborn babies into the worst asbestos-ridden tower blocks in the country for political purposes. And I'm effectively quoting or paraphrasing the investigator who was employed by the council many years later to look into what had happened. So, I mean, it is amazing how poor communities become such huge political footballs and the victims of constant interference from central and local government to somehow socially engineer them, usually, of course, as we know now, also through physical means. So anyway, this tenant's choice, which was a statutory transfer, so not a voluntary transfer, so it was forced, provided a mechanism for us to transfer the estates into resident-controlled, community-based ownership. In other words, it's a housing association. Its membership, not exclusively, but in the vast majority, is residents on the estates. About 70 or 80%, because it's sort of, it's changing that number, are members of the association. That gives them the right to attend the AGM, to elect their neighbours, to govern the association and to manage the assets and so on. And in those board meetings, the residents decide on all of the policies, they decide on what the rent increases should be, everything. Because we own the properties, this is not a management thing, we manage them as well. But we own them, and that's the critical difference. So in 1992 was the year where we actually ended up taking ownership, nearly 20 years ago now. At that stage we took hold of 921 homes, so it was about 600 or so in the Victorian terraces and about 300 in the tower blocks and stuff on Elgin here. And we're now down to 640 because we demolished the tower blocks and we also converted a lot of one beds into family flats. And it's mixed population, is about 20% leasehold and most of the rest is tenanted. And it is unique because it's England's only statutory transfer of council stock into community ownership. It's a standalone organisation. We're not dependent, we're not a subsidiary or dependent on any other organisation. We employ over a dozen staff. The organisation is the mainstay of the area. We're providing high quality homes, support for households, which there is great recognition for amongst those households, and a whole range of community services and activities, which we're quite proud to be able to say, whilst other such activities around the area are suffering from the cuts, ending essentially now. All the WECH activities will be carrying on as per normal, if not more enhanced, because we own the assets that generates the income to support that. So now, getting back to the whole housing, the debate about communities, poor communities, council estates, how to improve neighbourhoods, empowerment and all that stuff. Over the past few years, you've had this debate on the future of social housing. So on one hand, people who think we should punish people and deprive the poor, that will somehow and disperse them, that will somehow solve the problem. And the other view is that what we should be doing is empowering communities by giving them ownership and control of assets. And it was very much to investigate and to provide evidence to support that second route that we, over a long period of time, have been looking here at this issue of whether community ownership at WECH has actually delivered measurable benefits to people's people's quality of life, both, if you like, collectively, ways you can measure that, and individually. So we commissioned academic research. We had Professor Peter Ambrose from Brighton, and then we had Dr. Madhu Sanghi from Stirling. And it was a deliberate choice to go for the Scottish thing because there is up in Scotland developments in community ownership. Some islands and estates have gone over. Although it's, again, it's a programme that's much under-resourced, and there's many more opportunities up there to pull off fantastic community takeovers. Nonetheless, there are important developments up there, which it's we should be connected with, and so our Satsangi man is involved in some of that up there. Anyway, we did this research and we looked at the population on here, the WECH population, and Professor Ambrose went out. We had housing students from the LSE doing the actual interviews, and they went out and they asked something like 74 questions. I mean, it was a killer. And you actually, the residents have to be quite committed to community ownership and involvement just to, do the questionnaire. Anyway, these were great in-depth questions. A lot of it was asking them, across the whole thing of well-being and happiness, quality of life, views about the area, about influence, all of this stuff, the stuff that's in the citizenship survey, some of you may be aware of that, those questions, right? And we were really trying to get to the bottom of could we get some numbers out of this? Now, that bit of the exercise looked at the WECH population and asked them to think about their experience now and compare it with the previous landlord, Westminster. Now, we weren't surprised to discover that people were enormously happier now than they were under the previous landlord, who was, of course, out to get them. That wouldn't make you feel very happy. So the other part of the exercise was to look at comparing the WECH population results with results to these sorts of questions in other populations. And in the end, we did England, London, and partly inner London. And then we had a go at comparing with the NDC populations to see whether we could detect any interesting things there. Now, I'm just going to quickly run through WECH residents are a bit more deprived than most other similar council estate type communities, okay, but they're similar profile. But the results show that the population is happier and it is more engaged. now than it was with the previous landlord. People feel a much stronger sense of belonging to the neighbourhood, and they feel much more able to influence decisions, the decisions of the landlord. And it's interesting, where we did a direct comparison with the citizenship survey on this one, and the Welsh number on, or rather the national number on people feeling very strongly that they belong to the neighbourhood is 38%, and the Welsh number is 52%. And that's, you know, a very big difference. And similarly, we have another number which again is directly comparable with the citizenship survey, which is able to influence decisions affecting the local area. And again, the national number is 38 and the Welsh number is 62. So people are, you know, whether they can or can't influence decisions, or they feel they can. So that probably suggests that they can. The satisfaction levels are obviously much higher. Over the past few years, we've had satisfaction levels, and these are on very high sampling, samples, ranging from 88 to 94% here, and they are obviously much higher than you would get for other social landlords or housing associations, especially in a London. And that spreads into satisfaction with it's not just the landlord, but with the broader neighbourhood. We got a lot of written comments. We got people the interviewers wrote down a host of comments. And by the way, this paper is available, which summarises all this. And it's very interesting to read what people actually say. And there were 3 words that came out of all of those hundreds of comments. One was that the organisation listens to them, and that they feel that it listens. Then they say the organisation cares about their homes and their neighbourhood, and then they talk about different ways or examples of how Welsh has specifically helped them as an individual, with some whatever it is thing in their life that isn't necessarily, directly housing related. Now I know I'm using time badly here. We've shared these findings with with government ministers and with the ONS, who, as you know, are doing this consultation on the Cameron's National Wellbeing Index. So just to summarise then on the Welsh one, before we go into the next one, is that Welsh we've proved that community ownership of council estates is not only possible, but it's sustainable over a long period of time, and it is highly beneficial for neighbourhoods. We've got the proof, the academic proof now. And now we know that one thing we could say is politicians across all political parties want to tackle social deprivation, but there is not a consensus about which particular route to go down or which emphasis to have. But there is a consensus about the benefits of community ownership and asset transfer. So the answer is not to punish and further deprive poor communities or seek to disperse them, but to empower them through asset transfer to become more independent and better able to support themselves. Right, that's the Welsh one. Moving straight on to West Ken and Gibbs Green. Well, here we have another 2 council estates in a similar part of London, 4 miles away, similar number of homes. The difference here is that they're not in bad condition at all. In fact, quite the reverse. They're in very good condition. They're very nice homes. Lots of them are houses with gardens and garages, would you believe, and off-road parking. They're lived in by a settled community. Who's quite happy with its homes, but unfortunately, another Dame Shirley Porter-like figure, Councillor Stephen Greenhouse, who's in charge of Hammersmith and Fulham, he has gone on record as basically spelling out another of these social engineering approaches, which is you've got to clear out council estate communities from inner London because they vote Labour, and you've got to replace them with much denser neighbourhoods, which are stacked with, as we know, places to sell. Now, of course, they can use the fiction of affordable housing, so they can say they're trying to create affordable housing, because affordable housing is anything up to 80% of market rent. Anyway, we have 750 homes, we have a diverse population, we have a settled community with good access, transport, facilities. So in fact, here we have, we have a community which is all right, but the council wants to come in and destroy it, partly for its political purposes, but it, of course, as we know, it also fits in with the whole developer thing of greed. So this developer, Capco, bought Earls Court exhibition centres and wants to do a redevelopment, £5 to £8 billion, 7,500 homes, million square feet of offices, whole thing sticks up like a sore thumb with tower blocks up to 30-something stories high. And they're trying to bribe the community by saying, we'll move you to a nice new 3-bedroom flat in this thing, and 95% of it will be not social rented affordable housing. It will be over in House with Fulham. They've invented their own loony, and along with the Boris thing, this intermediate housing where apparently affordable housing, if you earn £74,000, you're entitled to affordable. I don't understand it. Anyway, it all gets mad. Now, the thing about it is this, so the last 2 years I've been supporting residents there to try to save their estates from demolition. Now, there's one thing having a negative thing, but you've also got to have a positive thing. So what we spotted early on was that the Labour government had introduced a thing at that stage called Section 296 of the 2008 Housing and Regeneration Act, which granted the right to a tenant group to propose the transfer of their council homes to an alternative registered provider, i.e. a housing association. And that, effectively, is a sort of son of tenant's choice. A bit like the GLA is the son of the GLC, they're different, but they're doing similar. This also, likewise, is a very different piece of legislation, but nonetheless the principle of giving council tenants the right to force a change of landlord. If their landlord turns nasty on them, they should have the right to do that. So that's what it is. It's now called Section 34A of the 1985 Housing Act, brackets, as amended, because that's what it does. And however, Labour introduced it in the 08 Act. It was actually brought into force in 09, but they never made the regulations. So in other words, they never actually implemented it. It was a classic Labour. We lobbied them really hard. Please implement your own legislation. Thought that was to talk about a minimal demand. Anyway, they, ifs and buts and hit about it and all that stuff and gave us nice words and didn't do it. And then the new government came in, but as we know, this new government, all in favour of big society localism, empowering people, blah, blah. So off we went back to them and said, you're in favour of all these things, so surely you must go. And then we got the responses back, because this wasn't just West Kent and Gibbs Green, this was a number of other council estates around the country and in London and elsewhere who are interested in this, wrote into the ministers, and some very funny little replies came back. Basically, the ministers know what to do. Oh, yeah. And the civil service lady, well, we don't know what to do. We've got to explain it to the ministers. You imagine that took a while. And then eventually, towards the autumn of last year, they started to get their ducks in a row and realised that there was something going on here. And we discovered in November and December that the coalition government had decided that Grant Shapps had decided that, oh yes, it is, it's localism, the big society, look, you're empowering, community asset transfer, mutualisation, all these opportunities. I don't believe that Shapps and Pickles understand this big society localism, whereas I hope that people like Greg Clark and maybe Francis Moore, I wonder about him too sometimes, but I hope that some of these people understand it more than others. And sometimes Shapps says these things, but whether he understands it, who knows? But anyway, nonetheless, they sign up to saying it's their intention to make the regulations, right? So, of course, we were very pleased down on the West Kent and Gibbs Green estates. It's a shame this is not in colour, but you can see just the sort of headline you want to put out, isn't it? You know, we wrote to the Prime Minister demanding that he do this, and he went back and said yes, boom, whatever next. Anyway, that's all very well, of course, isn't it? But where's the detailed action? And that's where we're a bit mired. You know, there's been delays in CLG about making, you know, actually bringing these regulations out. They were drafted 2.5 years ago. CLG said they were going to issue. I've got the minutes of a meeting in November 2008 where it's recorded that CLG said the next thing we're going to do is publish them for consultation. Oh dear. Anyway, so this is a really serious test of the big society because, of course, can the government? It's one thing for, say, a Tory council leader to try to frustrate a Tory or coalition, you know, Conservative Lib Dem government policy. That's one thing which might be embarrassing, and so they might not want to see that happen. But it would be even more embarrassing if the ministers themselves were trying to frustrate their own policy. So if they start taking sides with our battle because of the politics, and they're not going to be able to do that. And obviously, the more we expose and you know, share this information with others and prod them, hopefully, the more likely they are to get on with what they're supposed to be doing and empower people. Right. So that's our big test for the big society. The government has said it wants to empower communities to take control of their neighbourhoods. If the Prime Minister and his ministers are really serious about this, then they've got to publish these Section 34 regulations quickly as they can. They've got to prove that council estate communities are also part of the big society. It's not just villages out in rural wherever. And they've got to back up this financially, and I'm sure this is what other people are going to be going on about. They've got to support and resource community groups to take up the new right to transfer and the other rights which are listed in the localism bill. Otherwise, the big society project will fail. There's no question about that. Now, the Grant Shapps called for an English revolution. I don't know if some of you saw that. That was a few months ago. He called for a very English revolution. So I think I should remind you of what Gerard Winstanley said in 1649 at the height of the last English Revolution, when he said, "Words and writings are all nothing and must die, for action is the life of all, and if you don't act, you do nothing." Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. So that's our first test of the big society.